Hey.
All right, welcome to Facebook Live. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
I am so excited to talk today because I just want Sonia to be our best friend.
Yeah.
I would like to have a call with her weekly where we just talk about things.
Yeah, Sonia Cabell is incredible. And it's so funny because it wasn't just me and you. We had someone else from Great Minds who also talked to her like within a week and also wanted her to be their best friend.
Their best
so I
buddy.
I know. I'm wondering if listeners feel the same just from the podcast. Like, do you all want her to be your best friend too? Because she's incredible.
I love that she's very relatable and down to earth. Like,
Yeah.
as a researcher and,
I
Dr.
did.
Sonia, she's so knowledgeable and smart, but she makes it really easy to understand.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to say on Twitter, we had a couple people one person said that they knew her personally and that she's a great person. And someone else wrote, she's a fantastic both as a reading researcher and a person. So I think it's funny that it's so interesting how quickly that comes across that she's just like such a genuinely nice and super intelligent person.
Yeah, completely. And I think the quote that the one quote that stood out to me from the podcast the most, and I just want it written everywhere, is the knowledge we bring to a text is the key determinant on how much we understand that text.
Why do you love it so much, Lori?
I love it so much because one of our social media posts this week talked about myths and facts about reading science and like what is happening in the social media world about reading science. And a big myth, I think, is that it's just about phonics or phonemic awareness, but the science of reading includes all of the pillars of reading, right? So phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. Also, the two things that Sonia talked about a lot, which were oral language and most importantly, knowledge. And I think that knowledge is the thing that oftentimes gets left out, but is the big component. And as she said, a big determinant of whether a reader can understand a text.
Yeah. And I just want to be really clear for our listeners and everybody that does not mean that phonics and phonemic awareness and decoding is not important. They are, and they are the key to being able to get the words off of the page to make any sense of it. But once students are able to do that, then they think, well, not then, right? We worry about it from the beginning, but we have to think about that other side. And like you said, knowledge is something that is often overlooked. It's not seen of as something that we can help with, right? It's like, oh yeah, that's just up to the rest of the world to figure out how they get the knowledge. But it is something we can do something about.
For sure. And I think what's really important is that it's not like first we're going to teach, it's not, I think, and I can't remember if we said this in the podcast because we recorded a while ago with her. It's not learning to read and then reading to learn. And we talked about that with Nell too. It's both. So it's while students are learning to read, we also can be reading to learn. And that might not mean that they're reading everything. It might mean some shared reading experiences, some read aloud experiences, but we're still supplying them with complex, rich text, vocabulary, knowledge in a very sequential form, right? So we know students need lots of exposure to vocabulary and it needs to connect to schema that they have. And we talk about it in context and things like that. That all is part of knowledge building.
And we did talk about that with Sonia because specifically she is doing her research on content-rich ELA instruction, which we'll get into in the early grades, right? So she is saying, and I've actually, I think I had a discussion with someone on social media about this who was like, well, I thought, Wit and Wisdom specifically was for grades 3 and up. Like, absolutely not. Like, we have to be thinking about how we are building that knowledge in K2 alongside of the phonics and decoding and those foundational skills. And like you said, the reason we keep bringing up oral language is because a lot of it in those early grades is done orally. It's what they're hearing you read aloud. They're hearing you talk about a text. They are talking about the text that they just heard read aloud, right? It is a lot of oral that is building that groundwork for when they are able to read it on their own, they have all this knowledge, vocabulary, they have a way to talk about texts, they have all of that to bring to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I'm going to do a little spoiler on in our newsletter that will come out on Tuesday. That's why I recommended in our, Lori recommends and Melissa recommends sections. I recommended that that teachers in K2 really, really think about how they can build knowledge in all facets of their instruction. And I pulled out geodes as a readable, decodable, knowledge building text for kiddos in K2. But if you don't have geodes, you could still choose decodables that meet what you've taught in those foundational skills lessons, but then also maybe bridge some knowledge into what they're learning in science, social studies, or content-rich ELA. So I think it's about being intentional in the choices that we make and not just saying like, here's a decodable book on, cats, and you're learning about, the rainforest in science. Like, how can we make intentional choices as educators to build knowledge, but also knowing that it's really important that, for example, in decodable text, that they're practicing those skills. So I think that there's really intentional ways that we can do this. And it just, it takes some thought when we're planning and preparing to teach.
It reminds me of our episode, I don't know the number, but with our good friend, Corey Jensen, who...
I'll look it up for you while you talk.
His curriculum was not as knowledge rich as he had hoped. So he did some of that work himself, right? Of like pulling together other texts to make these like thematic units that lasted a little longer than they might have in what, his curriculum said to do. They were moving on quickly from topic to topic, and he did more to build that knowledge and bring in other texts that helped to build that knowledge, just like you said.
Yeah. And I love that he provided that example with a curriculum that I don't think it is one of the ones known for more knowledge building, if you will. So he realized that and recognized that and thought, how can I, as a teacher, knowing that this is maybe not a strong suit of this particular program, but I know that knowledge is really important. Like I remember him saying, I read The Knowledge Gap and I started learning all of these really important things. He's going to love Sonia Cabell, by the way. This is important. And how can I do this and bring this to my students? And I loved how he was like, let's just get to work. Let's intentionally add this in. It's episode 78.
78. Excellent. So Jen, in our comments, she brings up a good point that Sonia talks about on the podcast as well, which is a lot of times ELA curricula is in these like thematic units, which makes you feel like, don't I have text sets happening? Right. I do. I have texts that are all about courage. Right.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're building knowledge, right? Because you could be talking about courage in the Civil War and courage in walking to the bus stop. I don't know. Your courage can be anything, anywhere. And so there's like a loose thread that might tie those together, but it doesn't necessarily build any knowledge. Can you talk a little, Lori, or do you want to talk a little bit about what makes it different?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about, for example, like building knowledge on, like you kind of just said, on like courage, which is more like a topical.
Well, that's like thematic, right? It's
a theme, which is not. Sonia did call this out. That is not
knowledge.
Not building knowledge.
No,
building knowledge is going, and I think I said topic. I didn't mean to say that earlier, but building knowledge is going deep into the study of a topic. And many times that looks like answering a question where you're diving deep to build a lot of knowledge on, I say a topic, but it means like more than a topic. You're talking about one thing, but you might be reading or watching or listening to a whole lot of texts that align to learning about that topic. So you're getting lots of vocabulary exposure. You're getting lots of fluency practice because the vocabulary is similar. So or repeated.
like, I mean, I think topic's okay. Do you think topic's not okay?
No, I think topic is okay. I said it instead of saying theme earlier.
Gotcha,
all these keywords.
Yeah, like topic to me makes, like, rainforest is a great example that you brought up, right? Because you could be reading about the different animals, right? Your books could look very different about different animals, about the rivers, the types of trees, the climate, right? It could be all different things that you're reading about the rainforest, but they all connect together. And like you said, the vocabulary you'll start seeing build on each other. They'll be able to make those connections because, that this knowledge is sticking to that knowledge, and like, oh, this animal does this in this climate because of that, right? And you can see connections being made. Whereas like that thematic one, there might be a very loose connection, but it's not going to be that same building of vocabulary and knowledge in the way that building on one topic would.
Right. I'm actually wondering if we can give an example of like a question that we might ask in order to like explore building knowledge. Is that something that you think we can do?
I'm not sure I know what you mean, but if you have one in mind.
I'm actually trying to pull up like so that I can be as accurate as possible, an essential question. Because I don't have them all memorized from Wing Wisdom.
You don't have them all memorized? I can't believe
you. Seriously, what kind of person am I?
Can I just talk while you pull something up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do have just maybe taking you off track, but bring me back. Another thing I just think is something that I talked to someone on social media again that was interesting was this hard for people to understand this idea of the content-rich ELA instruction and that it's not science or social studies.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
I think when I was trying to explain that, like, you might explore a topic like the Civil War for a whole quarter in ELA, they're like, that's social studies, right? Like that's fine to, like, yes, we need social studies, that's great, but that's not what I do in my ELA class. And so I think that's an interesting distinction that Sonia talks about, and I think might be worth getting into here.
I agree. That is actually a really good point. That, and she does say it really, really clearly that we are not substituting content-rich ELA for science or social studies time. That the purposes of accessing those texts are different.
Yes.
So
we still want science and social studies, and we still want them to read in science and social studies and write in science and social studies. So you can help build literacy in those content areas. But what you do in a content-rich ELA class is a little bit different.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to give an example of a question that we might explore in a content-rich ELA that could connect to, I'll say, science.
Okay.
How do people learn about the sea? Right. So students then might explore poems, texts, videos, artwork that then they're pulling knowledge from about how people learn about the sea. And they're working toward answering up this big question, but it's going to be broken down into smaller parts and chunks for them to absorb in their learning. But at no part during how do people learn about the sea, like I would say likely at no part, are they doing a science experiment, with, I'm imagining the bottles and they're like pouring ocean water in and like looking under microscopes for the organism. That's the science part of it. That's right. But that's not the ELA content rich. In the content rich ELA part.
Right. Or I'm like thinking too, it's not, this is poor instruction no matter where you are, but it's not like you just give PowerPoints about how people explore the sea. And you're like, here's another way you explore the sea. And here's another way people explore the sea. Right. Like that's also not what we're talking about. Jen actually put it in the comments again. She's on it today.
Thank you, Jen.
She said that, where it starts for content rich ELA instruction is the complex texts, right? Like the texts are very important.
Not to say texts are not complex either in science class. But
I'm sure they're very important.
Yeah, but it's different. It's a different text. It is in a content-rich ELA, you may be reading literary texts that are about exploring the sea, right? I'm thinking about when I did this with Presley, when Presley was during COVID. We, when we talked about how people explore the sea, we read a book called Shark Attack. We read Amos and Boris. We read The Fantastic Life of Jacques Cousteau. We read other texts too. We read a poem and other ones, and watched videos of a scuba diver scuba diving. That's going to build her knowledge. And then bonus, when in science class, maybe in fourth
totally
grade,
different ways.
In totally different ways, she's looking under the microscope and exploring what like saltwater looks like under the microscope. By the way, I don't know if that's something you do in science class. I have no idea. But if it is, her knowledge will be deepened, and she might be able to pull some of that she learned from her content-rich ELA. However, in science, you'll still be using the content-rich language that you use in science and vocabulary. It's just, there's overlap, but it is a different lane.
Right. But the great thing, like you said, like, I mean, in ELA classes, often like the texts are just so different every day, right? It's like, oh, like I like this story, I'm going to read this story, or the curriculum says this is the story for the day. And it's just so different when you do what you just said, which was, you have a combination of literary text, informational text, poems, videos, all these texts, but there's a connection, and you're helping students see that connection so they're aware, like, I'm building my knowledge by reading all of these different texts.
Yeah, you're building knowledge over time, and that's the best way to build knowledge, right? Because then as you gather it, you can remember it because you're continuing to learn more about it. It's connecting to things that you already know. But what I think is also really important, and I saw this in Baltimore, is there was so much cohesiveness between what students learned throughout the year in their knowledge build, but then also what they learned. I always thought of it like horizontally and vertically. So then, if they're a third grader, there's cohesion in that knowledge, but then there's also cohesion in what they're learning as, a third grader then goes and becomes a fourth grader. Okay. So then there's some cohesion there, and a fifth grader, and all of that. I think what makes me really excited about high quality materials in general is that that's something that, we didn't have before when we were in Baltimore. It was a curriculum that lots of different people had written. It wasn't cohesive. Everyone tried their best, but you can't do what people do if it's their job. And so the high quality materials, I feel like, really brought that content rich ELA to a whole new level, both in that horizontal knowledge build and in the vertical knowledge build. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I mean, what I was just thinking when you were talking about it is, it's like that's a really hard thing for a teacher to do without a curriculum. That's just what I was thinking was, what we mentioned earlier that Corey's doing. He's supplementing something that he has a starting point and he's able to like build on it. I'm just imagining a teacher accept the standards to go on. It's tough, and I would.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first thing, were those standards. It's hard.
That's all I had, right? So then to try and think, like, how am I going to build this like unit where I have these, rich texts, these complex texts that also build knowledge and also builds on what they'll learn next year and the year after. Like, oh my goodness, there's just no way. Like, I see it. If I was back where I was in that spot, I feel like more than like I'd have to do what I need to do for my kids, but I would more so also be pushing like, hey, we need something better.
Yeah. One of my good friends is a first grade teacher. I always want to say she's second grade, but she's first grade. And she was in a district where they didn't have anything. Like every day it was like, here's what the thing you're supposed to teach. And then you find your own book. And I mean, she called me more than once, just like frustrated and upset. Like, I'm ordering books off Amazon. Like, what do you recommend I do for knowledge building? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's just this should not be part of your job. And my heart goes out to teachers who are in that situation, because it is really difficult. And I think we want to honor that.
Yeah.
That it is such a huge benefit to have a content rich ELA curriculum that builds knowledge. I am happy to say, though, they did adopt a curriculum.
Yeah.
For
I
next
would
year.
say, like, if I were, oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna say the thing I put in the newsletter this week, I think gives some recommendations for that, like to create these text sets, which is nice to say, but it is hard, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that if you are on your own doing this, it might not look the same way as a full curriculum, but, you know, do your best to try and make connections between those different texts. Like you said, like when they're practicing decoding, see if that can connect to something that you're doing during a read aloud. Like, where can those connections be made so that you're building as much as possible?
For sure.
With what you have.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that we got to talk about content-rich ELA, because I think there are some misconceptions about it, in that, well, maybe, you know, like you mentioned about crossing over with, like, it could substitute for science or social studies time. And I'm really glad we had a conversation about it, because it's important for, I think, like a shared understanding of the different times in the day and the purposes of them. And you hear content rich ELA, and teachers are so short on time anyway. And we're like, oh, twofer, but it's not. So we want to make sure we talk about it and share why.
Good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you haven't already, listen to episode 116, Sonia Cabell, on the importance of content-rich ELA instruction. And she will say some of the same things we said, but a whole lot more, and the research that supports it. And she's super smart, like we said at the beginning. So
and super cool.
Great to listen to.
Super cool.
Listen to the end to hear all of her very funny answers to our questions.
Yes, she had great answers. I will say, it is the reason why I can't remember if she shared this before we started or at the end, but it is the reason why Presley and I are reading Twilight right now. I thought it was before too. We're reading Twilight right now. Thanks, Sonia. All right. Have a great Friday, Melissa.
She might have put it on there.
She might have.
All right.
Have a great Friday, Melissa.
Bye, Lori.
Bye.